Prior to Spanish colonization, the Andean region of Bolivia was a part of the Inca Empire, while the northern and eastern lowlands were inhabited by independent tribes. Spanish conquistadors arriving from Cuzco and Asunción took control of the region in the 16th century. During most of the Spanish colonial period, Bolivia was known as Upper Peru and administered by the Royal Court of Charcas. After the first call for independence in 1809, 16 years of war followed before the establishment of the republic, named for Simón Bolívar, on 6 August 1825. Bolivia has since endured periods of political and economic instability, including the loss of various peripheral territories to its neighbors, such as Ica, parts of the Gran Chaco and its coast. Pre-Hispanic period. The region that is now known as Bolivia has been constantly occupied for over 2,000 years, when the Aymara arrived in the region, eventually settling in western Bolivia, southern Peru and northern Chile. Present-day Aymara associate themselves with an advanced civilization situated at Tiwanaku in western Bolivia. The capital city of Tiwanaku dates as early as 1200 BC as a small agriculturally based village. The community grew to urban proportions between AD 600 and AD 800, becoming an important regional power in the southern Andes. According to early estimates, at its maximum extent, the city covered approximately 6.5 square kilometers, and had between 15,000 and 30,000 inhabitants. However, satellite imaging was used recently to map the extent of flooded raised field agriculture across the three primary valleys of Tiwanaku, arriving at population carrying capacity estimates of anywhere between 285,000 and 1,482,000 people. Around AD 400, Tiwanaku went from being a locally dominant force to a predatory state. Tiwanaku expanded its reaches into the Yungas and brought its culture and way of life to many other cultures in Peru, Bolivia, and Chile. However, Tiwanaku was not a violent culture in many aspects. Tiwanaku became very political and did this as a way to expand his reach, creating colonies, trade agreements, and state cults. The empire continued to grow with no end in sight. William H. Isbell states that Tiwanaku underwent a dramatic transformation between AD 600 and 700 that established new monumental standards for civic architecture and greatly increased the resident population. Tiwanaku continued to absorb cultures rather than eradicate them. Archaeologists have seen a dramatic adoption of Tiwanaku ceramics in the cultures who became part of the Tiwanaku Empire. Tiwanaku gained its power through the trade it implemented between all of the cities within its empire. The elites gained the status by the surplus of food they gained from all of the regions, and then by having the ability to redistribute the food among all the people. This is where the control of llama herds became very significant to Tiwanaku. The llama herds were essential for carrying goods back and forth between the center and the periphery, as well as symbolizing the distance between the commoners and the elites. The power continued to grow in this manner of surpluses of resources until about AD 950. At this time a dramatic shift in climate occurred. At this point in time there was a significant drop in precipitation for the Titicaca Basin. Some archaeologists even venture to say that a great drought occurred. As the rain became less and less, many of the cities further away from a lake Titicaca began to produce less crops to give to the elites. As the surplus of food ran out for the elites, the power began to fall. The capital city became the last place of production, due to the resiliency of the raised fields. But in the end, even the intelligent design of the fields was no match for the weather. Tiwanaku disappeared around AD 1000 because food production, the main source of power, dried up. The land was not inhabited for many years after that. Between 1438 and 1527, the Inca Empire embarked on a mass expansion, acquiring much of what is now western Bolivia. However, they could not maintain control of the region for long as the rapidly expanding Inca Empire was internally weak, but nonetheless left the greatest mark on the Bolivian culture. In 1430, the Inca civilization swept across the western part of Bolivia. During this time, the Incas' expansion increased under the rule of the 9th emperor Pachacuti Inca Yupanqui, whose reign lasted from 1438 to 1471. Pachacuti Yupanqui was succeeded by his son, Topa Inca Yupanqui, whose reign also increased the Incam territory and lasted from 1471 to 1493. During the 15th century, the Incas conquered the region of Lake Titicaca, the last of the Aymaran people and the last of the native Bolivians. Thus, western Bolivia became a part of the Inca territory. Spanish colonial period. Conquest by Spain. Francisco Pizarro, Diego de Almagro, and Hernando de Luque led the Spanish discovery and conquest of the Inca Empire. They first sailed south in 1524 along the Pacific coast from Panama to confirm the existence of a legendary land of gold called Peru. Because the rapidly expanding Inca Empire was internally weak, the conquest was remarkably easy. After the Inca Emperor Huayna Capac died in 1527, his sons Huáscar and Atahualpa fought over the succession. Although Atahualpa defeated his brother, he had not yet consolidated his power when the strength. Atahualpa did not attempt to defeat Pizarro when he arrived on the coast in 1532 because the Incan ruler was convinced that those who commanded the mountains also controlled the coast. When Pizarro formed alliances with Indians who resented Inca rule, Atahualpa did not modify the Inca ceremonial approach to warfare, which included launching attacks by the light of the full moon. Atahualpa's refusal to accept the permanent Spanish presence and to convert led to the bloody Battle of Cajamarca on 16 November 1532. Pizarro executed Atahualpa's 12-man honor guard and took the Inca captive at the so-called ransom room. 1 year later, the Inca capital of Cuzco was refounded as a new Spanish settlement. Despite Pizarro's quick victory, Indian rebellions soon began and continued periodically throughout the colonial period. In 1537, Manco Inca, whom the Spanish had established as a puppet emperor, rebelled against the new rulers and restored a Neoica state. This state continued to challenge Spanish authority even after the Spanish suppressed the revolt and beheaded Tupac Amaru in the public square of Cuzco in 1572. Later revolts in the Bolivian highlands were usually organized by the elders of the community and remained local in nature, except for the Great Rebellion of Tupac Amaru II. The amount of these revolts can be accredited to the foe's nature and the faces. During the first 2 decades of Spanish rule, the settlement of the Bolivian highlands, now known as Upper Peru Charcas, was delayed by a civil war between the forces of Pizarro and those of Almagro. The two conquistadors had divided the Incam territory, with the north under the control of Pizarro and the south under that of Almagro. But fighting broke out in 1537 when Almagro seized Cuzco after suppressing the Manco Inca rebellion. Pizarro defeated and executed Almagro in 1538 but was himself assassinated 3 years later by former supporters of Almagro. Pizarro's brother Gonzalo assumed control of Upper Peru but soon became embroiled in a rebellion against the Spanish crown. Only with the execution of Gonzalo Pizarro in 1548 did Spain succeed in reasserting its authority. Later that year, colonial authorities established the city of La Paz, which soon became an important commercial and transshipment center. The conquest and colonial rule were traumatic experiences for the Indians, easily susceptible to European diseases. The native population decreased rapidly after contact. Indian resistance delayed the conquest and settlement of the Bolivian lowlands. The Spanish established Sierra in 1561, but the Gran Ce colonial name for the arid Chaco region remained a violent frontier throughout colonial rule. In the Chaco, the Indians, mostly Chiriguano, carried out unrelenting attacks against colonial settlements and remained independent of direct Spanish control. Spanish administration. During most of the Spanish colonial period, this territory was called Upper Peru or Charcas, and was under the authority of the Viceroy of Lima. Local government came from the Real Audiencia of Charcas located in Chaquisaca and La Plata. Bolivian silver mines produced much of the Spanish Empire's wealth, and Potosi, site of the famed Cerro Rico, rich mountain, was, for many years, the largest city in the Western Hemisphere. The longevity of Spain's empire in South America can be explained partly by the successful administration of the colonies. Spain was at first primarily interested in controlling the independent-minded conquerors, but its main goal soon became maintaining the flow of revenue to the crown and collecting the tribute of goods and labor from the Indian population. To this end, Spain soon created an elaborate bureaucracy in the New World in which various institutions served as watchdogs over each other, and local officials had considerable autonomy. Upper Peru, at first a part of the Viceroyalty of Peru, joined the new Viceroyalty of the Rio de la Plata when it was created in 1776. The Viceroy was aided by the Audiencia, which was simultaneously the highest court of appeal in the jurisdiction and, in the absence of the Viceroy, also had administrative and executive powers. The wealth of Upper Peru and its remoteness from Lima convinced the authorities in Lima to create an Audiencia in the city of Chaquisaca in 1558. Chaquisaca had become particularly important as Potosi's administrative and agricultural supply center. The jurisdiction of the Audiencia, known as Charcas, initially covered a radius of 100 leagues around Chaquisaca, but it soon included Santa Cruz and territory belonging to present-day Paraguay and, until 1568, also the entire district of Cuzco. The president of the Audiencia had judicial authority as well as administrative and executive powers in the region, but only in routine matters. More important decisions were made in Lima. This situation led to a competitive attitude and the reputation of Upper Peru for assertiveness, a condition reinforced by the economic importance of the region. Spain exercised its control of smaller administrative units in the colonies through royal officials, such as the corregidor, who represented the king in the municipal governments that were elected by the citizens. By the early 17th century, there were 4 corregidors in Upper Peru. In the late 18th century, Spain undertook an administrative reform to increase revenues of the crown and eliminate a number of abuses. It created an intendancy system, giving extensive powers to highly qualified officials who were directly responsible to the king. In 1784, Spain established 4 intendancy districts in Upper Peru, covering the present-day departments of La Paz, Cochabamba, Potosi, and Chaquisaca. At first, the Spanish crown controlled the local governments indirectly, but in time slowly centralized procedures. At first, Viceroy Francisco de Toledo, Count of Oropesa, confirmed the rights of local nobles and guaranteed them a local autonomy, but the Crown eventually came to employ Spanish officials, corregidors de Indios, to collect tribute and taxes from the Indians. Corregidors de Indios also imported goods and forced the Indians to buy them, a widely abused practice that proved to be an enormous source of wealth for these officials but caused much resentment among the Indian population. With the first settlers in Upper Peru came the secular and regular clergy to begin the conversion of the Indians to Christianity. In 1552, the first bishopric in Upper Peru was established in La Plata. In 1605, La Paz and Santa Cruz also became bishoprics. In 1623, the Jesuits established the Royal and Pontifical Higher University of San Francisco Xavier of Charcas.After, Upper Peru's first university. Indian reaction to colonial rule and conversion to Christianity varied. Many Indians adapted to Spanish ways by breaking with the traditions and actively attempting to enter the market economy. They also used the courts to protect their interests, especially against new tribute assessments. Others, however, clung to the customs as much as possible, and some rebelled against the white rulers. Local, mostly uncoordinated, rebellions occurred throughout colonial rule. More than 100 revolts occurred in the 18th century alone in Bolivia and Peru. Although the official Inca religion disappeared rapidly, the Indians continued the local worship under the protection of local Indian rulers. But as Christianity influenced the Indians, a new folk Catholicism developed, incorporating symbols of the indigenous religion. Whereas early Indian rebellions were anti-Christian, the revolts at the end of the 16th century were based in Messianic Christian symbolism that was Roman Catholic and anti-Spanish. The Church was tolerant of local Indian religions. For example, in 1582 the Bishop of La Plata permitted the Indians to build a sanctuary for the Dark Virgin de Copacabana on the shores of Lake Titicaca. Indian resentment to colonial rule increased in the 18th century when Spain demanded higher tribute payments and increased meter obligations in an attempt to improve the mining output. These profound economic and social changes and the breakup of native culture contributed to the increasing addiction of Indians to alcohol. Before the Spanish arrived, the Incas had consumed alcohol only during religious ceremonies. Indian use of the coca leaf also expanded, and, according to one chronicler, at the end of the 16th century, in Potosi alone, the trade in coca amounts to over 500,000 pesos a year, for 95,000 baskets of it are consumed. Increasing Indian discontent with colonial rules sparked the Great Rebellion of Tupac Amaru II. Born José Gabriel Condorcanqui, this educated, Spanish-speaking Native American took the name of his ancestor, Tupac Amaru. During the 1770s, he became embittered over the harsh treatment of the Indians by the corregidors de Indios. In November 1780, Tupac Amaru II and his followers seized and executed a particularly cruel corregidor de Indios. Although Tupac Amaru II insisted that his movement was reformist and did not seek to overthrow Spanish rule, his demands included an autonomous region. The uprising quickly became a full-scale revolt. Approximately 60,000 Indians in the Peruvian and Bolivian Andes rallied to the cause. After scoring some initial victories, including defeating a Spanish army of 1,200 men, Tupac Amaru II was captured and killed in May 1781. Nonetheless, the revolt continued, primarily in Upper Peru. The supporter of Tupac Amaru II, the Indian chief Tom Mascatri, had led an uprising in Potosi during the early months of 1780. Catri was killed by the Spaniards a month before Tupac Amaru II. Another major revolt was led by Julian Apaza, a sexton who took the names of the two rebel martyrs by calling himself Tupac Catri. He besieged La Paz for more than 100 days in 1781. During the siege, 20,000 people died. In 1782, an Aymara woman, Bartolina Sisa, was executed for raising yet another revolt. Spain did not succeed in putting down all of the revolts until 1783 and then proceeded to execute thousands of Indians. In the late 18th century, a growing discontent with Spanish rule developed among the Criollos. Criollos began to assume active roles in the economy, especially in mining and agricultural production, and thus resented the trade barriers established by the mercantilist policies of the Spanish crown. In addition, Criollos were incensed that Spain reserved all higher administrative positions for peninsulares. The Enlightenment, with its emphasis on reason, questioning of authority and tradition, and individualistic tendencies, also contributed to Criollo discontent. The Inquisition had not kept the writings of Niccolò Machiavelli, Voltaire, Denis Diderot, Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Paine, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, John Locke, and others out of Spanish America. Their ideas were often discussed by Criollos, especially those educated at the university in Chuquisaca. At first, the Criollos of Upper Peru were influenced by the French Revolution, but they eventually rejected it as too violent. Although Upper Peru was fundamentally loyal to Spain, the ideas of the Enlightenment and independence from Spain continued to be discussed by scattered groups of radicals. Struggle for independence. As Spanish royal authority weakened during the Napoleonic Wars, sentiment against colonial rule grew. Bolivian historiography dates the proclamation of independence to 1809, but 16 years of struggle followed before the establishment of a republic, named for Simón Bolívar. The invasion of the Iberian Peninsula in 1807–08 by Napoleon's forces proved critical to the independence struggle in South America. The overthrow of the Bourbon dynasty and the placement of Joseph Bonaparte on the Spanish throne tested the loyalty of the local elites in Upper Peru, who were suddenly confronted with several conflicting authorities. Most remained loyal to the Spanish Bourbons. Taking a wait-and-see attitude, they supported the Supreme Central Junta in Spain, a government which claimed to rule in the name of the abdicated Ferdinand VII. Some liberals eagerly welcomed the possible reforms to colonial rule promised by Joseph Bonaparte. A few officials supported the claims to a type of regency of the Spanish realms by Ferdinand's sister, Carlota, who at the moment governed from Brazil with her husband, Prince Regent John of Portugal. Finally, a small number of radical Criollos wanted independence for Upper Peru. This conflict of authority resulted in a local power struggle in Upper Peru between 1808 and 1810, which constituted the first phase of the efforts to achieve independence. In 1808, the president of the Audiencia, Ramon Garcia León de Pizarro, leaned towards affiliation with Carlota, but the oidores of the Audiencia favored the Supreme Central Junta. On the 25th of May 1809, the oidores deposed President Garcia León and established a junta to govern in the name of Ferdinand VII. On the 16th of July 1809, Pedro Domingo Murillo led another revolt by Criollos and mestizos in La Paz and proclaimed an independent junta of Upper Peru, which would govern in the name of Ferdinand VII. By November 1809, Cochabamba, Oruro, and Potosi had joined the La Paz junta. Both revolts were put down by forces sent to La Paz by the viceroys of Peru in the Rio de la Plata. During the following 7 years, Upper Peru became the battleground for forces of the United Provinces of the River Plate and Royalist troops from Peru. Although the Royalists repulsed 3 Argentine invasions, guerrillas controlled parts of the countryside, where they formed 6 major republicatas, or zones of insurrection. In these zones, local patriotism would eventually develop into a full fight for independence. By 1817, Upper Peru was relatively quiet and under the control of the Viceroyalty of Peru. After 1820, conservative criollos supported General Pedro Antonio de Ollañata, a Charcas native, who refused to accept the restoration of the liberal Spanish Constitution of 1812. Ollañata, convinced that these measures threatened royal authority, refused to join either the liberal royalist forces of the rebel armies under the command of Bolívar and Antonio José de Sucre. Ollañata did not relinquish his command even after the Peruvian royalists included him and his forces in their capitulation agreement following their defeat in the Battle of Ayacucho in 1824. Ollañata continued a quixotic war during the following months until Sucre defeated him, and he was killed by his own men on 1 April 1825, in a battle that effectively ended Spanish rule in Upper Peru. A constitutional congress declared Bolivia an independent republic on 6 August and named the new republic in honor of Bolívar because it considered him its founder. 19th century. During the presidency of Marshal André de Santa Cruz, Bolivia enjoyed the most successful period of her history with great social and economic advancement. Santa Cruz got involved in internal Peruvian political problems and succeeded in unifying Peru and Bolivia into a confederation, the Peru-Bolivian Confederation, as Santa Cruz openly declared the Inca Empire as a predecessor of his state. This move was perceived as a threat to regional power balance and a menace to countries on former Inca territory. The War of the Confederation broke out and different wars against almost all its neighbors were fought during this period with sound victories against its enemies. Arguably, the turning point took place on the fields of Porcapata, where the Confederación Peru-Boliviana, led by Santa Cruz, forced the Chilean and Peruvian rebel armies to sign the peace treaty known as the Porcapata Treaty, which included their unconditional surrender. Later this treaty was discarded by the Chilean parliament. The rebel Peruvians and the Chilean army set off to a new war against Santa Cruz, defeating the Confederation on the fields of Yungay. This was the turning point in Bolivian history. After this moment, coups and short-lived constitutions dominated Bolivian politics for nearly 60 years. Going through a vicious economic and political crisis, Bolivia's military weakness was demonstrated during the War of the Pacific, when it lost its seacoast and the adjoining nitrate-rich fields to Chile. An increase in the world price of silver brought Bolivia a measure of relative prosperity and political stability in the late 1800s. During the early part of the 20th century, about 1907, tin replaced silver as the country's most important source of wealth. A succession of governments applied laissez-faire policies through the first third of the century.